Today's Q&A is about Jewish ownership, and the question is it easier to give hashgacha to a factory which is owned by Jewish people rather than people who are not Jewish? So most people are pretty surprised to find out that if a Jew owns a food production facility, that leads to certain chumras, certain ways that we have to be stricter with that person that wouldn't apply if he was not Jewish. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. So the first is that most factories are open all year round. They get ingredients, they produce things, they ship things out to their customers and things like that. So if any of those ingredients are chametz, which basically means if they have wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt in it, then a person who's Jewish can't own them or do any business with them on Pesach. Now, if it's in your own house, then we solve that problem by destroying the chametz or selling the chametz for Pesach. But that's not always so practical for a factory to close down or to not do any deliveries and get any deliveries over Pesach. They want to keep on sending out to their customers and things like that, and most of them have a hard time closing for Pesach. Now, if the person is Shomer Shabbos, of course, that's what he's going to do. It's a mitzvah to do that. But if he's not, it could be quite difficult for the person to come to that conclusion to do that. Now, it's not just a personal decision what he does, because if the owner violates this halacha, then the food becomes also forever. It's called chametz shalav Pesach. It only applies to chametz, not to kidneys, but it would make the food essentially not kosher. You wouldn't be allowed to eat it. So people giving hashgacha would have to make sure that the owner follows these halachas. And sometimes the logistics of doing that makes it so difficult that eventually the company just says they can't get certified kosher just for that reason alone. Okay, now another thing. Now, of course, that only applies, I should mention, that only applies if the person is Jewish. If he's not Jewish, he's allowed to own chametz, and there wouldn't be a concern. Okay, now, another thing is, if the company makes things like bread, cake, pizza, and things like that, and the Jewish person, meaning the company, owns the dough at the time when the flour and the water get mixed together, meaning they actually create the dough themselves, then they have an obligation of hafrashas challah. Now, if there's a Shomer Shabbos person in the factory all the time, then he could take care of it. He could do the hafrashas challah. But in most factories, that's not such a realistic possibility. So hashgachas came up with a system where they they do hafrashas challah for the company, but they do it remotely. What does that mean? It means is the company will have dough or matzah, which is obligated in hafrashas challah, meaning it's tevel. Challah has not been taken from it. And each day, the rabbi who's not there, he's remote, he's 500 miles away, he makes a declaration that a bit of that tevel that's in that dough or matzah that he left there should be serve as the hafrashas challah for the batches that are made that day. Now, there's all kinds of practical and halachic issues, in setting up such a system and using it. And so there are some people who are very not so comfortable with it. But in practice, most of the national hashgachas rely on it in one form or another, either for actual hafrashas challah, and it's just as a backup. Okay, and next thing is that there's a requirement. There's a general halacha called pas Yisrael, which is to say is that a Jewish person has to participate in the baking of things that are breads and cakes and things like that. Now, the general halacha is that pas Yisrael is not required when it's produced commercially for sale by someone who's a baker, and we only have to be makbid on pas Yisrael for the letter of the law. We only have to be makbid on pas Yisrael for a private person baking, a non-Jewish person baking for someone else. However, the Shach says that kula, which we call pas palter, that if it's made by a baker, there's no requirement for pas Yisrael. The Shach says that does not apply when a Jewish person owns the bakery. Now, according to that hashgacha, in a case where a Jewish person owned the factory, the hashgacha would have to make sure that the food is pas Yisrael for all these kind of foods, that if they bake those kind of foods. In practice, that's what the Shach says. In practice, most hashgachas rely on what Moshe says, who he has reasons to say what the Shach says doesn't apply to commercial factories, and therefore most hashgachas are not makbid on this particular din. Now, last is that if a Jewish person who has a farm or raises animals has to worry about all kinds of other halachas of Yashan, Zroyal Chayim Keva, even in Chutz Aretz, in Eretz Yisrael, but Yashan and Bechor, certain kinds of halachas that would not apply if those same farms were owned by people who are not Jewish.